Good morning. I will call the meeting of the 911 Advisory Board meeting into session. It's 10 o'clock. First order of business is roll call. Chief Scott Howland.
Present.
Brenda Brunner.
Present.
Leanne Magoski.
Here.
Hanan Harb.
Present.
Sheriff Ingrid Braun is absent. Sheriff Corey Honey, absent. Chief Edwards Hadfield, absent. Chris Herron.
Present.
Chief Elise Warren.
Present.
And Chief Craig Carter.
Present.
We do have a quorum. Next order of business is approval of the minutes from the November meeting of 2019. Are there any corrections? Excuse the noise. Are there any corrections? Do we have a motion to approve?
I'll make the motion.
I'll second.
Okay, motion by Chief Warren, second by Hanan Harb. Okay, roll call vote. Chief Scott Howland.
Aye.
Brenda Brunner.
Aye.
Leanne Magoski.
Aye.
Hanan Harb.
Aye.
Sheriff Braun is absent. Chief Hadfield is absent. Chief Carter.
Aye.
Sheriff Honey is absent. Elise Warren.
Aye.
Chris Herron.
I'll abstain. I was absent in November.
Did I catch everybody? I missed somebody. Oh, I got everybody. Okay, motion is approved. The next order of business is a closed session. Will be held upstairs in room 222. Please take your closed session package with you. And we stand adjourned for the moment. Well, you'll get an answer. I don't know if it'll be right, but. I have that problem off. Okay, we're reconvened. It's 10:37. We have nothing to report out from the closed session. There was no action taken. The next order of business is legislative update from Patricia.
Good morning. So for the 2020 state telecommunication bills, we have AB 1366, which is a VoIP and IP-enabled communication services. This is a leftover from last session. It would extend the sun date for VoIP deregulation until January 1st, 2025. AB 2163, Rural Broadband and Emergency Infrastructure Grant Act by Rivas, was introduced on the 11th of this month. It creates a grant program for state fairground broadband and infrastructure installation to support emergency response operations. SB 431 is a mobile telephony service base transceiver station towers performance reliability standards, also left over from the 2020 session. It requires the CPUC in consultation with Cal OES to develop and implement performance reliability standards for cell towers within designated high fire threat areas, which include establishing minimum operating life for backup power to no less than 48 hours and a customer warning system when backup power system is low or dying. This is related to SB 925, which is very similar. It's a cell tower performance by Glacier, which would require similar reporting and require the CPUC to collect relevant data to assist in the creation of the standards. SB 753, Public Social Services Emergency Notifications by Stern, would permit county social services departments to share contact information of elderly or disabled persons to emergency services during a public safety power shutoff. SB 794, Emergency Services Telecommunication by Senator Jackson, would allow local governments to enter into agreements with local social services and public utilities to collect information on people with access and functional needs and residents, to input that information to alert and warning systems. Also, it would allow for performance reporting on emergency notifications from the telcos to the CPUC. And our last state bill, SB 1069, was introduced yesterday. It is from Senator Jackson as well, about critical communication infrastructure. It would require telecommunication service providers to report critical infrastructure data to local emergency management and to report to the CPUC on the efficacy of alerts and warnings sent through their network. For the federal bills, they are the same as our last session. HR 292, Tribal Communities Broadband Service by Member Curtis, which streamlines broadband permitting process to allow states and tribes certain authorities for permitting within land owned by the federal or the National Forest System, Department of the Interior and Tribes. S-273, the Kelsey Smith Act by Senator Roberts, which would require emergency services service providers to share users' device location with law enforcement or PSAP representatives to respond to a call for assistance or a life-threatening emergency. HR 3836, the Wireless Infrastructure Resiliency During Emergencies and Disasters Act, or the WIRED Act by Representative Eshoo, which would amend the Federal Communications Act to allow states to develop terms and conditions for infrastructure resiliency of wireless service providers, authorizing states to require wireless companies to deploy infrastructure that can withstand disasters. Any questions?
Any questions? Okay, thank you. Last week, also, some representatives from Cal OES and Leanne Magoski participated in 911 Goes to Washington, which is a national emergency number, or NENA, coordinated event. We visited, at least the folks from the 911 branch and I visited 10 of our congressional offices, 2 senators and 8 congressional representatives, and I know Leanne visited a bunch also. There was 2 pieces of legislation that NENA is particularly interested in. One is the 911 SAVE Act by Congresswoman Torres that would reclassify 911 operators as public safety as opposed to clerical. And the other one, and I can't remember the specific name of it, but it's regarding Next Gen 911 funding that's moving through. I believe there are companion bills in both the Senate and the House. We'll be monitoring those because that could have significant impact, on funding for moving to Next Gen 911 as well as an appropriate classification of public safety operators into the public safety realm. Any other questions regarding that? Okay, moving on to agenda item number 5, Mr. Courier. 911 branch update.
All right. Good morning. My name is Budge Courier. I'm the 911 branch manager. Yeah, you need that part. I'm the 911 branch manager, and I'm going to be providing an overview of the points that you see on this slide here. We've tried to condense the material, so we're not here for several hours. However, if there's any specific questions you have, please feel free to interrupt me at any time, because the purpose of this is to make sure that you're informed so that we can hear back from each of your representative agencies and associations, organizations, to make sure that we're on the right track is really what this conversation is about. So we're going to start out with the 2019 call stats. So these are the first time you've probably seen these numbers. So we each year compile the stats from the previous year. Those of you with a really good memory will recall that in 2018, we had roughly 27 million 911 calls as well. I think there was a delta of like 300,000 difference from one year to the next. So we're seeing the number of 911 calls hold fairly steady. 82% of those are wireless, and that's up about 1%. 13% are wireline, and that number held steady from the previous year. Voice over IP is 5%. Telematics, that number is actually going down as we get a little bit more granularity in how we're classifying these. And probably the stat that's changed the most in terms of numbers is text to 911. We're up to 62,000 texts for the year versus 28,000 from the previous year. Now keep in mind, when you compare 62,000 to the total 27 million 911 calls, that's a very, very small percentage. But we are seeing, as we bring more and more PSAPs online, the number of texts are increasing. So these are our numbers from 2019, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
The increase on the text 911 compared to the increase of the dispatch centers that are taking the text, did that go about the same?
It is. It's roughly the same correlation as we bring more and more centers on. We aren't seeing any one center become inundated with text. You know, it's a very, very small percentage of the overall call volume, but a very important percentage, because those people that are using text to 911 are following the messaging that we're giving, where it's call if you can, text if you can't. So those ones that can't call are the ones that you see coming up in this statistic, and it's a very important statistic for us.
Just a clarification compared to how we do stats in our county. That's 62,000 messages back and forth. That's not 62,000 conversations.
It's sessions. That's sessions.
Text sessions. So there
That's-
is actually more than that. Thank you.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a session. So if you and I have 30 back and forths in our
Right.
session, that
It's
counts
one.
as one.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, otherwise the numbers could be artificially skewed, so we're viewing it at the session level.
Perfect.
Yeah, same thing with, you know, the 911 call. If the call goes on for 30 minutes, it's still just one call. Yep. Yeah, so maybe we'll clean this up and add the word session in there. I think that'll make it a lot clearer. It's a good takeaway. Okay. So the next category we want to talk about is our fiscal and operational review. This is where we go out and visit the PSAP and work with them on any question that they may have, from funding to operations, meeting the statutory requirements, how they function as a PSAP. Last year, we were able to visit 96 different PSAPs and complete a fiscal and operational review. The year before, we did 112, and if you're wondering why there was a slight downtick, it's because we went about 3 months where a couple of those positions were vacant. We have 4 PSAP advisors, and whenever somebody promotes out of one of those positions and leaves it vacant for a little while, we have to kind of catch up to that pace. We fully expect to be at the 120 mark this coming year. And again, we make the offer, if we have not been to your PSAP in a while, and you think it's time for us to come, please invite us, and we will get you sort of head of the line in our process. We want to make sure that we're meeting the needs of the PSAPs and we're visiting you when you need us. In addition, if the board thinks of anything that they want to make sure that we're doing at those fiscal and operational reviews, we would appreciate that feedback as well. The process is fairly well dialed in, but we can always make it better. And so if there's any feedback you have for us, if you've been through a recent fiscal and operational review, let us know and say, hey, if you could add this one component, it would be very helpful. We'd appreciate that feedback as well. So the next graphic shows the number of CPE or customer premise equipment installs for the year. The reason why this graphic is so important is because it kind of gives you a historical snapshot of where we are. If you consider that CPE is on a 5-year replacement cycle with 2 optional years of maintenance, from this graphic at a glance, you can see that anybody who replaced their system in, longer than 5 years ago, say 2015 and prior, is probably due for an upgrade in the very near future. So you can kind of get a gauge, and this is what we do from our staff. You can see that we have a nice bubble coming in the 2016 timeframe when we did 94 installs that year. And so that's one of the reasons why we're pushing so hard on the next version of CPE contract, or we're changing the name from call customer premise equipment to call handling equipment, because it's no longer going to be on-prem. But and I've got a couple of graphics on that on down the road, but that's where these stats really come into play. So any questions on this graphic? One thing I'll point out is what we don't show on this graphic is the size of the PSAP that replaced their equipment, and sometimes they're very large, like say for example LAPD, and sometimes they're rather small, whether it's a 2-position PSAP. They would all count as just a 1 in that system acceptance signed off column. We'll talk a little bit about text to 911, and I'm assuming there's going to be some questions here. So this graphic, we replaced the very busy eye chart that had all the counties on it that was almost impossible to read. We have that data if you want it. We can give you a breakdown by county, and we certainly have all that information. But for purposes of displaying on a slide, we thought that this graphic was much easier to represent, certainly at the strategic level that we're focused on here on this board. So the number of PSAPs that have the web over-the-top solution, which today is offered through Comtech, is 244. There are another 15 that are pending deployment of that, and that's meaning they're right about at the point where they're ready to start accepting text. We have many more that are in the pipeline. Integrated text, integrated means that it's integrated into their CPE and displayed through their CPE. We have 45 that are currently integrated today, and there's another 54 that are in the pipeline. And then there's 80 PSAPs that are sitting out there that are pending a decision. So we have a couple of pieces of good news with the pending decision. They will take text by January 1st, 2021. That's the legislative mandate. So the when has been answered. And we've made it very clear that if they are not fully deployed with an integrated solution by June of 2020, then they will be web over the top. Right? So these are the stats now, and I've got one more graphic to go through, but if you have a question, go for it. You sure? It's on text. Yes. So as I said, AB 1168 says that all PSAPs must take text by January 1st, 2021. We are going to work with the California Department of Technology, CDT, to extend our current contract. So the goal is to be business as usual with text the way you know it today until we have a fully compliant next-gen 911 solution ready to go. And then we will roll that solution out to the PSAPs. Then this way we're minimizing the impact on the PSAP while still meeting the statutory requirements of having to have everybody deployed by January 1st, 2021. So that's our plan moving forward. When we come before you in May, which is our next advisory board meeting, we'll have a lot more detailed information on where we are on the next gen 911 deployment process. And that requires that the NG911 core services are up and running, and we don't have an exact date for you. We know that's going to be sometime this summer, but Atos, our prime vendor, needs their core service platform up, running, and tested in order to deliver net text through the next-gen 911 environment. We also obviously need network installed at every PSAP as well in order to deliver that text. So let's see what questions you have.
So on the PSAP counts, does that include only state-funded PSAPs, or does that include the military PSAPs as well?
State-funded only.
So this does not include military, so.
Correct.
Are they required to to take the text by January 1st?
That is
2021,
an
or-
excellent question that I do not know the answer to right now. I will have to get back with you on that. That's a very good question.
Thank you.
Yeah. Also a very hard question, which is not surprising. Thank you, Nan. Yeah, that's a good question. We'll probably be coming to you to help you with this. Okay, any other questions on text?
But just one question, the 80 pending decision kind of popped out at me and you addressed, and I'm glad that there's legislation to require them, within a year from that standpoint. But I know how big text to 911 is within our ADA community, within, there's some circumstances where text is much better than trying to make a phone call. Is there anything we can do as a board to encourage folks to speed it along so that we can see implementation prior to the mandated cutoff? Because it just seems like we've been working on text to 911 for quite some time. And while the number is small, when it's needed, it's really needed. And it'd be nice to be able to say statewide, we have text to 911.
Could I speak to that maybe?
Yeah, because we talked about this yesterday.
Yesterday at the Long Range Planning Committee, we talked about text for quite a while and hit on that very topic, honestly. And I think where we ended up was our offer was to the state to perhaps at either the May or August meeting to share the list of those, hopefully less than 80 at that point, but those PSAPs that still haven't committed, so that, very similar to wireless, Chief, I think you might have been around for that tail end, right, where we had a real small list, and we ended up just kind of divvying it up and saying, between the county coordinators and the board members, let's make some personal calls and see what these PSAPs need to make the commitment. So hopefully the state will come back to us this summer with that information if they still need help.
I think to go to that point, then if they're going to be publicly noticed in May, then maybe give board and the staff time to reach out, and let them know that this is going to happen in May too. And I don't mind helping out and reaching out to those that haven't pushed far enough. I think it's 80, is that what it was? So it may be best to give them an advance notice. I don't know.
Yeah, and we can get the list out to the board members. There's nothing about the list that we can't share with the board, so we'll get you the list of 80, and that way you at least have it, and you can start those conversations now. Yep. Okay, any other questions on text? All right, so next we're going to move into Next Gen 911, and what we've done with this update is we've tried to group it into buckets that make sense from a project deployment time frame. And so as we move through this discussion, I would appreciate some feedback on how we've grouped this to make sure that the briefing makes sense, okay? So this slide we will probably continue to put up. It shows the vendors that were selected for the various regions, and then obviously Atos as the prime. Up north we have Synergym, NGA 911 as the central and LA region, and then CenturyLink is in the south, and Atos has the statewide solution. So this graphic we'll continue to have there so that you have a one easy graphic to go to for anybody that asks, well, who is the vendor? This graphic is a high-level project overview. Yesterday at the Long Range Planning Committee, we got the feedback that you want more granularity. And so we will work on putting together a more detailed project timeline for you that maybe breaks out a little bit of each of these categories underneath. We don't want to make it too busy because then it becomes a Gantt chart that nobody can really read because it's 15 pages long. So we'll try and strike a balance there, and we know that this is not enough granularity. So we will come back with a more detailed version, one that maybe is digestible in a couple of slides instead of a single slide. And so far, we're on track for each of these deliverables that you see here, and I'm going to work through each of them in categories on the next couple of slides. So there are a number of activities that we need to coordinate in the 911 branch, all of which impact the PSAP. Obviously, text to 911 we've already talked about. The site surveys have been completed in a majority of the state. The one exception is in the north. There are a few PSAPs that have not, the surveys have not been completed yet. They should be finished up by the end of February. This next bullet, PSAP facility readiness, this is the work that we need to do at some PSAPs, and it's not all. It could be as simple as we've got a half a rack of equipment here, space, and a half a rack there. Can you move this stuff over there so now you've got your complete rack? That would be fall in there. It could be the fact that we need to bring power, twist lock plug and dedicated power to that rack. Or it could be more intensive than that. There's no physical room at all and more work is required. That's that one that's listed in there. As soon as, and we've already begun this in some of the regions, to actually begin to install the rack and equipment, that's the next step in the process. We've finished the surveys. We know what remediation work needs to be done at some of the PSAPs, and now we're beginning to install the rack. The network information is in progress, so this is the work that we're doing to determine for region, you're going to use these network providers. For prime, you're going to use these network providers. We've deconflicted the list between region and prime, and we've issued back the marching orders to the vendors to be able to deploy those circuits. And then obviously we're going to be in the back room finishing up the rapid deploy. I've got the graphic on that, on where we are on that. And then we're going to have a little bit of a discussion today on policy-based routing and what that means. And then the CPE contract is coming. So those are some of the activities that we're coordinating in the 911 branch. So I want to drill in on some details on a couple of these timelines and activities. The first one is the PSAPs. As I've said, by the end of February, we should be 100% complete with our surveys. Most of you in the room are probably already completed, I would imagine, those that aren't in Northern California. And your regional provider will be the next person that will come and install equipment. So we've coordinated that the regional provider in each region will install the rack, and then when Prime comes along, they will put their equipment in that bottom of that rack, and the region goes in the top of that rack. They're going to share space. They have different power feeds that are coming in, and the region will have the rack there ready to go, and then they'll install their equipment, and then the prime will come along. Once we get definitive install dates, we will let you know as a PSAP. Our timeline is a minimum of 5 days in advance, but we want to back that up as much as we can. One of the asks yesterday at the LRPC was if we could come up with kind of a flow diagram of what this looked like. You'll be contacted by Cal OES and kind of like a flow so that you could plug in your start date and then know what the rest of the process looks like for the install. We talked about doing a detailed project for the entire state, but the minute I do that and one PSAP moves, the entire schedule changes, and we would be spending all of our staff time just keeping schedules up to date instead of getting the work done. But I think that the diagram that shows the flow of how we're going to do the install, that's a great solution, because then you can plug in the start date for when you were contacted and have a reasonable sense of when your equipment would be installed and tested. And so we're going to do that. So with that, any other questions on sort of the work that we're doing at the PSAP, because I think this is the last graphic on that.
But just a quick question on that. I think the diagram's a great idea from that standpoint, because I think a lot is communication and setting expectations. And I know that depending on the city or county or facility and everything else, there'll be some interesting nuances that we'll find along the way. And so I'm just trying to figure out, I know you guys have done a lot of outreach, and just trying to figure out how we can enhance that outreach to ensure communication reaches those folks they need to get to from that standpoint. Because I think of, there are PSAPs in shared facilities where the PSAP operator is not the facility owner, and if someone's going to come into the back room, there's a process that needs to be gone through, and if that doesn't start early enough, when we show up to put in equipment, nothing's going to happen. And, so you have the nuance between the building, IT, governance, the list goes on of how can we expand that communication, and how can the board help with that effort? Because I think if we can help people really understand not only the flow, but what will happen, I think we can empower folks to take care of a lot of that stuff up front, as opposed to being delayed at the back end.
Yeah, so Chief, that's a great point. Once we get you the diagram, I think that would be the ask then, obviously for your organization, to reach out to all of your PSAPs, and they are different. We know that. Some are in a state-owned facility, some are not, some have different rules. Your PSAP supervisor at that particular location may have a certain way to do things, so we know it's not even one size fits all even for your organization. We know that. So once you get that diagram, if you reach out to your associations, whether it's police chiefs or fire chiefs or sheriffs or NENA, APCO, and start to message that out and give us feedback on the content of the diagram, anything missing, and if there's any peculiarities at a specific installation, that's the kind of information we need to know now so we can begin to plan for it. So I think that's an excellent idea. And as you said, there's no one way that this is going to happen everywhere, and we know that. So if you know of a nuance, and I know Hanan and I were chatting yesterday at the LRPC about some of the requirements that may be different for larger versus smaller installations and all that, that's the kind of information we need.
The other question was, again, about military PSAPs and next one for the military. Where are we going with that?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So we've completed the survey for the military PSAPs. I think all but the northern ones have been done. And we fed that information back to the Department of Defense, who's over all of the military installations. And each branch, of course, does things slightly different. I will say that the Marine Corps seems to be out in the lead, and that's not my own personal bias. But working with them, we were able to come up with a model for how this might look at all installations. And then we briefed that up through NTIA, which is the National 911 Program. Lori Flattery heads up that organization. And they reached across to Department of Defense, who's over all PSAPs for the Department of Defense. They have a meeting in May to discuss our proposal from a statewide perspective in California and to see if it's supportable and what that looks like for them. We've been very clear to establish demarcs on where our responsibility ends and where theirs begins, and how the network will remain segmented from their infrastructure that they've got out there, their Defense Information Systems Agency network architecture, which we cannot interact with. And so we think we have a very clear path forward. I'll know in May when their decision makers meet if they're going to endorse our plan. And then from there, what probably will be required is an MOU between the Department of Defense and the state of California. Kind of, this is our role, this is their role. And then we'll move forward with the deployment. And we're even able to install CPE and update their CPE at those installations as well, if they want to support that effort. And that will be dependent on each branch may have a different take on that, especially like an agency like the Navy, which dispatches for the entire nation. We couldn't fund both sets of that CPE because only one is in California. Things like that may differ from branch to branch. But for CPE that only services a single base, we would be able to talk to them about, hey, here's our CPE contract. If it meets your needs, here's the funding model, here's what we, the state, can do. And so we've had all those conversations, and we've left it in their court to vet through their process to make sure that they can support what we're doing from a state perspective. More word to follow. I don't know if we'll have the word back by the May meeting, but certainly by the meeting after that. And we'll report out what we know in May back to this board.
Just a follow-up question on the rack and servers. Is there a timeline how long that's going to take? I know it's going to vary.
You mean for the install?
Yeah.
Should be less than a day.
Oh, okay.
I mean, it's you know, they're for the install. Now, the testing, we're going to have to come back multiple times because depending on the timing, if we put the equipment in before the network is there, you can't really do a lot of testing. Mm-hmm. If the network is already there and installed, then they can do some testing, but then we've got to go one step further down the call path to test the integration with your existing CPE that you have on-prem. Okay. So that'll be another visit. So some of that timing is dependent, and that'll be in the flow chart. Like, okay, rack is installed. Yeah. Is network there? Yes. Okay, then we're going to do this test, which may take a little bit longer. Those tests, though, will not impact 911 in your facility, other than you're going to have somebody in your back room that you might need to be escorting.
Yeah, and that was the second piece on security pieces. I'm sure it's going to escort the whole time. Yeah. And that'll have to be relayed to dispatch center so they can have somebody that's going to take the time out of their day for that.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yep. No? All right.
We did discuss the security piece in depth. I mean, and in all honesty, it's a little bit of a challenge because we'll just share, right, that, I mean, I think the state determined they weren't really able to take that step in making sure that all of the techs that are going to be coming in have gone through some sort of a security check. So it likely results in, at minimum, these folks being escorted, and even some agencies may still have some requirements. So it is going to be a piece that might cause a little bit of a delay as that gets worked out.
So I've pretty much talked to everything on this graphic already. We just want you to understand that we are taking a look at the network and deconflicting the IP connections as much as we can. And as of right now, we don't see any showstoppers where we cannot bring network into a particular PSAP, which is the good news. Obviously, once you're shopping for the service, you get one answer, and when you actually order and install the service, it might be a slightly different answer. We're familiar with that, and our project managers are working with the regional and the prime provider because we know that that's coming. Once you actually order the service, there may be, again, some changes, and we're working through that process. All right, so let's have, we thought we might have a little bit of a conversation here on policy routing and what policy routing is and has the capability to do. So in today's world, when your 911 system goes down, you typically only have one choice. You hit an alt answer switch, and it goes to another PSAP that you've worked out an agreement with, and they may or may not be able to do anything with that 911 call once it arrives there, depending on what they have for radio and CAD and RMS. Moving forward, we can be much more deliberate in the planning process, and we can define the policy rules for what happens for a normal call delivery. By normal, I mean, what do we do when I've got 4 positions, all the positions are filled, and everybody's on the phone? Do I return back a busy signal? We could do that. Or 4 positions are filled, everybody's on the phone, and the 5th call comes in. You have an agreement with another agency that says, I'm going to take that call, and you've found a way to work with that agency so they can actually dispatch resources on your behalf and do something with that 911 call. We can set that up in policy. What do you do when someone calls 911 and it rings and rings and rings and no one answers? Which could happen for some reason in your PSAP. We can set that up in policy. What do we do when there's the call comes into your center and can't be delivered and you have not hit your alt answer switch? In other words, for some reason your center's offline and you have not been able to communicate that reason back to the system. That would be a policy we could set up. What do we do in the terms of a purposeful evacuation where you know you need to evacuate for some reason? Where do those calls go? And all of the scenarios in between. We can even support incident-based scenarios where you know you have a planned event that occurs every year and you set up an incident command post and an incident dispatch center at this location and you want all cell calls to go there from this start date to that end date. We can do that in policy-based routing. We can even break your jurisdiction up and say, hey, we're a really large center, CHP Golden Gate. I want calls in this region to go to this dispatch center in Fairfield, and over here they're going to go to Alameda, and this portion they're going to go to San Francisco. We can do that in policy-based routing. Really, we want to stimulate the conversation so you know what's possible from a technology perspective, and then you go back and begin to have the conversations with your neighboring agencies about what does this look like, how do we support it, how do we make sure that who's ever calling 911 gets the best service available. That's what policy routing is all about. We don't want to create a scenario where we, through technology, are sending a call where service can't be provided. That's not the goal. But we've begun to have these conversations with our regional task force, and there's been a lot of thoughtful conversation. We have a breakout session planned for NENA where we're going to talk about this for an hour in depth. and we're happy to engage with this board and have follow-on discussions with it. And so with that, I'll leave it there to see what questions you have. But it's a huge conversation that we're just beginning to have.
But Budge, kind of a concept question for you. As we're starting that dialogue, are people understanding that we will have options that we've never had? Because I think a lot of times when you talk about these things, I've always sent my calls to Pat. And so, no, I got a good relationship with Pat, so I'm gonna keep sending it to Pat, but I could send it to anybody.
Yeah.
Literally.
And the light bulbs are coming on. They really are. And that's the point of the slide. That's why we're going to continue to have these conversations at the regional level. And we hope that you take these back to the groups that you represent as well to start having these conversations, because you're right. We now can do what was never possible. And that opens up a whole new capability, because you can begin to do disaster planning that was not even in the realm of possibility. We can do that now.
And I don't have to have my next door neighbor. I could have a neighbor a ways away that we can do a CAD to CAD, so the calls roll over, we dispatch them, and it works
Yeah.
flawlessly.
Hanan said she'd love to back up CHP Golden Gate.
Right on.
But yes, that's a really good point. And don't think that you're restricted by your boundary within the NG Core Service platform either. If there's somebody outside your region that would be a good backup for you, we can do that. That's not a problem at all. The technology does not limit those kind of conversations. So for statewide agencies like yourself, really important. You could look literally statewide at which centers could back up which one.
Yeah, well, I mean, really, when you look at load sharing and everything else, so when we have these major emergencies, whether a fire or a flood or whatever, where there's inundation, of being able to push those out further geographically and free up more dispatchers to stay on the tactical side of things, it just really helps as far as our response and control and be able to, answer those calls much quicker, as opposed to, well, we're overloaded and doing the best we can, versus, all right, call volume spiked, push it out, get a whole lot of help. It just seems like much better service to the public, from that standpoint.
And there's even the capability to support, and obviously we know there's radio and CAD limitations, but there's even the capability to say, when all these lines are full, send the calls here, and then you go put 2 dispatchers in that center to help field those, because you've eclipsed the capability in your center. That's possible too. Mm-hmm. Whereas today, you can't even consider that. I mean, the system couldn't even do that. So those are the conversations that we're hoping to have. And through the regional task force, we're getting a lot of feedback and a lot of good conversation on this. And we're going to continue bringing it up at this level, because it's important. It's an important part of the capability that we're bringing with Next Gen 911. So,
Bud, could you see a PSAP that has, in the menu, they have 4 of the items that seem to fit for them, but the other 23 don't? Is it kind of pick and choose?
Absolutely, yes. And it's literally, under these scenarios, I'd like it to go to PSAP A, B, C, D, and that's that order. But in this other scenario, I want it to go to F, G, H.
Yeah.
It literally has that much capability.
And what's the possibility, it may not be as popular, but a forced conversation with, a PSAP in San Diego County having a conversation with Redding to say, when the bad thing in Southern California happens, I'm going to ask that you be my PSAP that we do the change of the calls to, and force that conversation to actually pick something out of region.
That is possible, and we had the conversation yesterday at LRPC. The big challenge there is, what do you do with the call once you get it? Right? 911, what's your emergency? Oh, I need an officer at such and such. Well, you can't dispatch that officer from Redding. So once you get through those operational challenges, the technology is there to support what you're doing. So we absolutely can do it, but there's a huge set of operational questions, some of which we are going to begin to address, and I think I have a talking point on it later, through a feasibility study that we're going to be kicking off soon. Go ahead. You had a comment.
I mean, we had a very long conversation about this, and, just to some of the task, the work group people really brought up, it's like, okay, now I have your call. Now I'm in your queue waiting and on hold. So now I'm being tied up, can't answer calls in my own community because I'm taking your call. So yes, the future and whatnot, but just really want to, location accuracy for next generation 911 and some policy-based routing, yes. But the idea of, San Diego taking over for Reading and vice versa, I think that's a very long way down. For CHP, I think this is fantastic because you already have this infrastructure built in. So, I mean, we can see some immediate, closer successes in those statewide agencies like Cal Fire.
Oh, absolutely, and I think part of it is really having that discussion of the back end, because if you can solve that CAD-to-CAD issue, suddenly I'm not stuck with a call, I just take the call, send it back to whoever I'm taking those calls for, unless it's an evacuation, then I got a radio and everything else.
Right.
But, for volume of call, then it's, okay, who's got a CAD system like mine that we have already got an interface? We just have to put our agreement together and make sure we're connected and
And that conversation is now and not.
Right, have those
bad things.
conversations now rather than later.
I mean, I like Leanne's idea that CHP handles all the calls, but I'm just not sure that's feasible.
Well, we need a
Well,
good partner
wireless
so we
started
can
that
send
way.
them back and forth. But I think it's really having that global perspective and making sure we have everything lined up so that, we're not stranding calls and then trying to call back where we really haven't fixed anything versus, okay, we've partnered, we've agreed, we've got a CAD to CAD, this is how it's gonna work so that we can really, take those calls and then start dispatching folks.
Yeah, I think some of the larger agencies in certain areas are willing to take one another's calls if this works, because they're close, they sort of understand. But there's always going to be that delay when you transfer the call. The other thing that, brought up, there are CAD to CAD projects out there that are now being placed on hold with state agencies because they say, nope, we are only focusing on this one right now. And so there are projects in the queue. So maybe with this, I know what you're going to talk about later, Budge, but advocating to get those projects going so that we can get more of these CAD to CAD links so that we can back up those agencies.
I know I have my own slide, but just to kind of close the loop on the discussion yesterday at LRPC, again, we talked about this at length, and all of the region groups reported out that this was a hot topic. And so I think that really the message at the end of the day was sort of there's two pieces to this. I'll get to the second piece. But the first piece being, yes, have these conversations, because instead of just that 1950s era switch in the back room that exists today to get calls routed, there's going to be a lot more, dynamic abilities. And so making sure people understand that, but then also encouraging them to start talking to their neighbors. Because if I send you my calls, but you don't have my CAD or radio system, really, what are you going to do with that? So it is a bit of a bigger conversation. We also asked the county coordinators to have a discussion, because I think there are some agencies out there that already act as each other's backups, and maybe they have an MOU in place so that that type of documentation could be shared, so you're not just starting from scratch, because it's a big undertaking perhaps. And really that second piece, which you guys have mentioned, is if I'm really going to take your calls and do something with it, then our CAD systems need to be connected. And so, we kind of threw it out there for the state that consideration of some ability to help with CAD to CAD in the future is a big piece.
Yeah, so one of the things, one of the pieces of the legislation passed last year was AB 911. If you read through the details of that statute, it requires Cal OES to conduct a feasibility study to establish a database where folks could enter specific information into this database. And then when you call 911, that information would be available to your dispatcher to say, okay, this person has voluntarily put their information in this database. And then we went one step further, because that's a bit myopic in the approach, to say, how could we actually get to the point where we have the ability to share more than just call information from one location to another? So it's really this CAD to CAD interface piece. So we went out to RFP, and through a competitive bid process, we selected a company. 911 Authority is the name of that company, and they will be, we'll have a kickoff meeting with them while we're at NENA, and then a follow-on meeting up here in Sacramento, and we'll begin to work on this report. So if there are specific things that you want them to look at in their study, specifically around data and CAD to CAD interface, let us know, and we will, we will incorporate it in there, as long as it doesn't go beyond the scope, obviously, of the contract that's already signed. But we think we've got enough flexibility in there. That's the next piece of the puzzle. So we will begin that report, and we're required to brief that report out to the advisory board, and we have to get that done by the end of the year. So you can expect that report to come and be presented to you, not in May, but certainly by the next meeting. And I don't know if you want to.
I think, so we're going to agendize that for our LRPC meetings coming up in the spring with anticipation of that final report being in the fall. So I think more discussion on that with the state.
Budge, another question? As we look at it, looking at location-based routing and everything else, I think we're all very excited about that. Do we have a projection as far as what percentage we will actually get location on versus what percentage we will still be missing a location on?
So you have to put it into categories. So if I go back to that graphic, if I remember the numbers right, it was 5% VoIP. So those will be maintained in a location database as part of the next-gen 911 system. You will get location on those. Keep in mind, VoIP location is entered by the user. So it's only as good as the user that entered it, but we will give you what's there. Wireline is, 14%, I think, of our call volume. That will be in the location database, so you'll get those locations through next-gen 911. And then what we're doing with our next-gen 911 core services is we've asked and required each of the vendors to be able to go through an algorithm in their emergency call routing function, which is the intelligence that's deciding where this call should go based on the location of the caller. To basically go through a list and say, okay, if device-based location is available, route on that, because it's the most accurate, and we'll validate that through testing. If it's not available, then go down to wireless phase 2. If that's available, route on that. And if that's not available, down to wireless phase 1. And if that's not available, then default route, and, well, that's probably you at that point, that would get the call if we don't have any information at all on where the wireless caller is. And so that algorithm is all built into the next-gen core services, and that's how we'll route calls. So we anticipate seeing a dramatic increase in the reliability of getting the call to the correct center the first time. And keep in mind, these are not misroutes. Sometimes it's because the cell sector, we have to send the entire cell sector to one PSAP. And we do a pretty good job of figuring out the right PSAP, but it's not foolproof because it crosses multiple boundaries, and inevitably you are in one of those places where it should go to a PD or to a sheriff instead of to highway patrol or vice versa. So those are some of the things that we're looking at, and I've got a graphic coming up on some of the location accuracy testing we've been doing.
Because as we roll down there, then we're, back to where we are today from the standpoint of, okay, where does that sector go and how do we continue to refine that process so that ultimately we get the most calls to the right spot on the first try, even when we don't have that device-based location, which would obviously be everybody's preference.
Yes.
But I just want to make sure we're looking at that, have those conversations in the right place, and how do we streamline that process to, again, make it easier and easier, because we all know how hard that process is today. And then how do we, while it won't be used as much, it's still important to make sure we have the right routing decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so anything else on policy-based routing? We knew that would be a good conversation. All right. Talk a little bit about where we are with GIS. So keep in mind the goal of our GIS data set is to develop what we need in order to route the 911 call in a next-gen 911 environment. So in order to do that, we need the boundary files of all the PSAPs in the state, primary and secondary and CHP, and we need road center lines and address points. That's the data that we need. We worked with a company called DDTI. They're finishing their work up. They're going to turn it over to our prime vendor, Atos, and they have worked with a subcontractor, Geocom. So any of you who are already using Geocom for GIS, there's going to be a very easy, correlation between the data you're working on now and what we're managing in the next-gen 911 system. We continue to work with our GIS task force, and Alicia is here in the room. She's a chair on that, and then my project manager, Natasha, is here as well for GIS. There's a lot more work to be done in GIS, but the good news is we've got the right people talking to one another to develop the policies and procedures needed to get the data where it needs to be by the summer of 2020 so that we have what we need to route in a next-gen 911 environment. And that's really what we're focused on right now. Keep in mind, this is different than the data you may be using from GIS to do dispatch in your CAD. Right? It might be a different data set. They may be compatible and the data may be shared between the two, but we're focused primarily on what we need to route a 911 call. And what we're learning is there's a lot of confusion there because there's some at the local level who assume that I'm using their data to directly route. In other words, when a 911 call comes in, I'm referencing their database to figure out where this call should go. And that's not the way the flow works. The way the flow works is their address points, their road center lines, their PSAP boundaries are validated with them. I put them in my system, check them based on Next-Gen 911, develop the algorithms needed to route, and then route the call. It's not a direct reference to their data. And so we're getting some local entities that are asking us to write like a letter of indemnification or something else that says that they're not responsible for the data they give me that I use to route a 911 call. And we can't do that because I'm not even using that data to route a 911 call, nor do I have the authority to write such a letter. We're using the data that's in the 911 system to route the 911 call, period. And that's the path forward. And that's what all this work is focused on here. So we're happy to answer any questions on GIS.
Well, it's just a quick question, and it's a huge project, get all the data together in the first place. And then are we having discussions at the same time as far as keeping that data up to date? Because I know the maintenance of that GIS data is really important from the standpoint as things change, as new developments go in, so that we are current on our call routing as opposed to don't know where you are.
Yeah, so the way that happens is twofold. There's a location database, which is essentially going to, and a location information system that will essentially mimic MSAG and ANIALI. And those databases are going to be maintained by the county coordinator through interface with GeoCom to validate the same type of process they're using today for MSAG, which is valid address ranges. This address range goes to that PSAP, that kind of coordination. And then we have to work with the originating service providers who are populating the data in that location database. And we have an interface for them. In other words, their customer, this phone number is at this address, and they can validate that. All of those processes are built into the functional requirements, and the update process is also in there, and we've included in the cost workbook a transaction-based way through tariff to keep those databases current. And one of the tasks for the GIS task force is to help us define the new role of the county coordinator and what that looks like. And so we're beginning those conversations now, and that's kind of the data validation piece. Yep. Okay. Alert and warning, we don't have a lot of updates from the last advisory board. Atos is working with Everbridge. We've begun conversations with any agency that's using Everbridge today to make sure that the lessons learned in current deployments are also included in this effort. Keep in mind, we are not taking away a local agency's authority to deliver an alert and warning. We're just simply providing a common technology platform that they can use for that delivery. And that's really what this project is focused on. Again, I don't have a tremendous amount of updates from the last time because we're still building the process out, and it will realistically be 12 months from now before we have anything that's live in this space, would be my guess. All right, seeing no questions. We'll talk a little bit about system monitoring. Just like policy routing, this is an important conversation for us to begin to consider the possibilities. In today's 911 system, you really don't have any direct visibility, right? For most of your centers, it's probably like, hey, it's kind of quiet in here. Are you getting any calls? No, I'm not getting any calls. Is it working? I don't know, let's call 911 and find out. And you call 911 and, oh no. And then you start the process of figuring out what's going on. And we laugh, but that's basically how it works today. It will not be that way in the future. The system monitoring capability that we're bringing into the network, you will absolutely know if your 911 system is up and running, and we'll even know we can even do some predictive modeling to know, hey, this carrier typically has this many calls during this time frame, and we're not seeing them. Let's trigger somebody to see if this is just one of those wonderful times of silence, or if there's actually a problem. That's where we're moving. And so one of the capabilities we're going to bring into the PSAP is for you to have a visibility into the status of that system. We're talking with Atos on some high-level system monitoring capabilities. Kind of think of like a green, yellow, red picture that at a glance you could just see, yep, the network is pretty good. Or maybe something's yellow, you click the button and it says, oh, it's this problem. We're kind of looking for some feedback on what that dashboard might need to look like. And I know it's a difficult ask because you've never had to really think about this yet because you've never had this capability. So we have some ideas that we're working with the vendor on, and we think we have this dashboard piece. Once we have something that's mocked up and ready to show, we'll show you kind of what we're thinking. And we look for more feedback. The other thing that's really important with this system monitoring piece is we don't want you to have to figure out who should I call. Like there's a problem, who do I call? So we've required all the vendors to e-bond their trouble tickets together so that you as a PSAP have one place to go, the region. You go to your region provider and you start a trouble ticket. And then they will triage it from there to figure out whose problem is this. Is it me? Is it Prime? Is it somebody else? And then we can begin to escalate from there. And then once the trouble ticket is opened, if it's somebody else, they update the trouble ticket and it feeds back through and you get that view back of what that status is. So that's that e-bonding piece so that you have a single point of contact. So we know that's really important. You should not have to figure out like who do I call. We're trying to avoid that. So think this through. It's really kind of a, imagine what's possible and give us some feedback on what you think we should be incorporating into this system. All right.
Before you go on,
Yes.
so when we look at monitoring and reporting, obviously network status is a huge component of that. And I think the other component that I'm very sensitive to, being a CIO, is that security component of making sure that our network is secure and we have appropriate security monitoring of our regions, our Prime, and everything else to ensure that we don't have issues from that standpoint, and also that we're ready for any attempted attacks, whatever those might look at now and in the future.
Yeah, so one of the things we're doing from a network security is we're getting ready to release an RFP to get a third-party vendor to come in and do an assessment of the network. And as part of that process, we are going to ask them, okay, how do we fold that into system monitoring? What does that look like? If it's a denial of service or some other telephone denial of service or some other type of attack, how's that indicated on a dashboard and how's that presentable to the PSAP?
Because I think included in that needs to also have response capabilities and then ongoing monitoring that will be updated, because security is not static. It's not a one-time assessment and we're good to go. It is something that's always going on, because anytime you have servers, you got to make sure you have patches, maintenance, and you skip something and suddenly we have a big problem. Yep. And I want to make sure we don't have a 911 outage as a result.
Yeah, agreed. So our lab, we're building a next-gen 911 lab. It'll be right upstairs from here. The equipment room will be just down the hall. We are going to be able to do preliminary testing in March in that facility, and then it will be fully operational in July. We've got to do some construction and move some walls and stuff. So once that facility is up and running, we'll definitely schedule a tour for the advisory board and give you a walkthrough of what capabilities are there, what the facility looks like. But this is something that we're doing to test not only next-gen 911, but the integration of CPE or call handling equipment, and also CAD and the other capabilities that we're trying to bring into the network. Location accuracy project. So this is the rapid deploy project that we began a little less than a year ago. And we've deployed, we have 232, actually I think that number's up to 260, 235 today. It's a little bit higher than 232 because this slide is a little bit dated, that are active with the solution today. We have deployed a Cradlepoint router in every PSAP where we need it. So that was a huge undertaking. The Cal OES technicians did that statewide. And we also have over 50 PSAPs that have a Comcast circuit to back up kind of that LTE backhaul connection. The remaining PSAPs are scheduled to be done in early 2020. And what we did in January is we actually did a validation test. And I'm going to be coming back in May with a detailed presentation. So this kind of goes to the questions you were asking, Chief. Basically what we did was we took a centimeter accuracy GPS device, and so we knew the location of the phone definitively. We knew the timestamp of when the call was made. And then we tracked the data that was coming into the clearinghouse, the Rapid SOS clearinghouse, from both Android and Apple devices, and then compared that with Annie Alley data that was coming through the call flow through the 911 system, and then aligned all that back up, which is why it's going to take me till May to have a detailed report to you, because you can imagine triaging that. And we did a test calls of about 1,600 calls in the LA area on every device platform from every carrier. So T-Mobile, Sprint, AT&T, and Verizon on both Android and Apple devices. And all of that data is there, plus the data that we've been gathering, which is somewhere in the neighborhood now, I think, of around 4 million calls that we've run through this test platform. So will be a lot more detail coming in May, but preliminary results are very good. We actually routed the call using NGA 911, simulating how the call would have been routed in a next-gen 911 environment, and in 100% of the cases, the call was delivered to the right PSAP the first time. That was not the case for the actual 911 call that had to be transferred here, there, because of the cell sector routing primarily. So that data is coming, and we're really excited about that, and that'll really help you drill down on that data. The feedback on this project's been very positive, and so we're continuing to push this forward. We're really excited about this project. Cloud-based CPE, I think this is my last talking point. I have Setna, but it hasn't changed since last time. So we released an RFP in December, and we've completed confidential discussions with PSAPs and with each of the vendors who wanted to meet with us. We're taking all that feedback. We're going to incorporate it back into the document, push it back out in late March, and we hope to have contracts signed by August. We don't see anything right now that's going to trip this timeline up, so the key action dates that were in the pre-solicitation, we think we're going to be able to comply with those. If anyone on the board has additional feedback, please reach out to us yesterday. As we are beginning to put all those comments together, you can imagine we got a lot of good feedback, and we want to keep this process moving forward. But this will move us from an on-prem type solution to cloud or data center only. So, any questions on that? This is a huge transition, and we understand that. Okay. Lots of positive feedback. It is a change, and so some people are like, wait a minute, can you explain this? But no one yet has ran out of the room screaming with their hair on fire, which is very good news.
That's your gauge?
That's our gauge, yeah. So if you really want to get our attention, light your hair on fire and run out of the room, and we'll know you have a problem. See? But there's been some really thoughtful feedback on this, and we've messaged this at our regional task force meetings as one of our primary talking points, and we've got a lot of good feedback on this. This just tells you kind of the goal and long-term vision. I'm not going to read this to you, but there's a reason why we're doing this, and we're trying to move away from some of the on-prem limitations that we have today, trying to embrace where technology is headed and actually drive the technology path in a way that meets the operational needs of the PSAP. And these are some of the things that we're making sure are incorporated into this CPE solution to make sure that it's secure, highly available, and dedicated, and able to meet the needs of the PSAP. And like I said, we've really got a lot of positive feedback from the PSAP community. This is our fund condition statement. It might be a little difficult to read here, but it's the same one I briefed out at the last advisory board. So as of right now, thanks to your efforts and the passing of SB 96 and the restructuring of the Setna fee, we are happy to report that we have the funding we need to be successful, and we've put appropriate resources in place to do that, which is huge. And if you're wondering how we set the fee, our appropriations for FY 2019, 2020 is there. The total number of access lines is 53 million. And based on that, we set the surcharge at 30 cents per access line. And it will be set that for all of 2020. So that went in place January 1st, 2020. And it will stay in place until December 31st, 2020. And then we start this whole process over again in August by taking a look at the budget that's currently going through the legislature now, taking a look at what our appropriations number is. We'll get a recount of the number of access lines, and then we'll reset the fee again next year.
Budge, could I have you just say that one more time, because it sounded so good that we're in a good place financially? It's interesting, Chris and I were talking earlier, just a few years ago, we were looking at the fund. It was red, we've got to do something, and it's really good to be in a good place, that the funding has kicked in, we have a plan, we're moving to Next Gen 911, and I think we've made tremendous progress. And I think it's always good to say thank you to the board and everybody who, behind the scenes, has worked really, really hard to get us here. Because, just a few years ago, the picture was quite different. And to be moving forward, having the resources and having a plan is just tremendous. And what it's going to do for 911 in the future, it's amazing.
So last year, in January, when I briefed this out, we had just failed to pass this in the Senate by one vote, and we did not have the funding. And we were talking about what we were going to cut and not fund if this didn't pass. That was 1 year ago. We actually had a special meeting. Remember, we recalled, and we're like, we're in trouble. And so my thanks to the board and your associations and all the support, and obviously the Ledge team and the work that they did in working with the legislature and the governor's office to get this through. This is absolutely huge, and we have a sustainable model now. We have a path forward, and we're really excited about that. So yes, you're exactly right. Yep.
Any more questions for Budge? Moving on to agenda item number 6, the LRPC update. Mr. Herron?
So, I know Budge alluded to kind of things have been streamlined at this meeting, and so yesterday's definitely wasn't. We took our full 3 hours at yesterday's meeting, and really, though, the topics were the same, and I touched on a couple of them as Budge spoke about them, because I thought it was just better to give our updates there. So just a couple other things, which I guess he also mentioned, but as a reminder to the board, we have the 4 working groups representing each of the regions. Southern, Northern, Central, and LA, as well as the GIS working group. So each of them continue to give reports at the LRPC meeting. As Budge mentioned, a lot of good discussion there. And to go with your sort of accolades, Chief, having been here for a bit and seen things change, right now, the amount of feedback that the state is asking for and receiving, is as high as it's been in my decade or so in management and in public safety communication. So whether it is here at the board, the LRPC, or those working groups that we have, literally we have a few dozen PSAP representatives that are able to have direct contact with the state representatives, or the state 911 office representatives, giving feedback. And so it really is, everything that's being done feels to us like it's being done very collaboratively. They're listening to us, making adjustments even, based on the feedback. And so it does, just feels like a really good time, especially with the funding in place. Actually, I think we've sort of covered everything that I have here in my notes. And so I'll just mention, we do have a LRPC meeting, an off meeting, if you will, in April 15th. And then we have another meeting May 19th, which is the day before the next advisory board meeting. So unless there's any questions. End of report.
Thank you. Any questions for Mr. Herron?
I have one. Is it possible that at your next meeting, could you take a look at where, from your perspective on the ops manual, if there's any changes that you see or things that we need to be addressing just as a future endeavor that we need to go down? Doesn't mean we need to have the changes done, but at least identify where you might see a gap currently in our administration, and so that we're able to kind of look at what things we want to add or potentially add in the future.
Sure. I know we've requested that funding specifically as it relates to the new CPE, or now being called the call handling equipment, RFP. Once that's in place, we have asked to discuss funding and specifically whether there will be anything that looks like residual funding does today, but we'll add the maybe a review of the complete manual through some sort of a working group.
Any other questions? Okay, next item up, just for your calendars, the upcoming 911 Advisory Board meetings are May 20th, August 19th, and November 18th. Moving on to agenda item number 8, we have received no cards for imparting public comment. Are there any members of the public that would like to make a comment? Going once, going twice? Okay, hearing none. For any information regarding, general information, contact Deidre Mortensen at the 911 branch, or media inquiry, Rob Mayberry from the Cal OES PIO's office. With that, is there a motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn.
Do we have a second?
Second.
Any objection? We stand adjourned.